In 1972, a low-budget ABC television movie about a vampire stalking Las Vegas pulled the highest rating any TV movie had ever recorded up to that point in American history. The weekly series that came out of it was canceled after one season. 3 decisions, made in 3 different rooms, killed it. And the last of those decisions came from the man whose face was on every poster. Today, those 20 episodes sit in television history as the show that made The X-Files possible. Without them, none of that exists. I'm Bast with Just Iconic Rewinds, and this is why Kolchak, the Night Stalker, failed. The story that circulates online is that Darren McGavin got tired of the role and walked away from the show. That story is technically true. It is also incomplete in a way that buries the actual decision that killed the series. The decision was made 6 months before the first episode aired, and it set off a chain of 3 different forces that stacked on top of each other. Darren McGavin walking out was the last of those 3. To see how a show this beloved ended up canceled this fast, you have to start with how absurdly high the bar had been set before the series ever existed. In January of 1972, ABC aired a television movie called The Night Stalker, written by Richard Matheson and produced by Dan Curtis. The premise was simple. A burned-out wire service reporter in Las Vegas covers a string of strange murders, follows the evidence past the point where his editor wants him to follow it, and concludes that the killer is a vampire. The Las Vegas Police Department wants the story killed. He publishes anyway. The movie aired on January 11th, 1972, pulled a 33.2 rating, and became the highest-rated television movie up to that point in American history. Richard Matheson won an Edgar Award for the teleplay. A year later, ABC did it again. The sequel was called The Night Strangler, set in Seattle, with the same reporter on the trail of an alchemist who had been killing women every 21 years, going back to the 1860s. That one hit too. By 1973, the network had a property on its hands that 2 consecutive specials had proven could draw a massive audience. The logical next move was a weekly series. ABC went to the 2 men who had made the magic and asked them to do it. Both of them said no. Dan Curtis, the producer, later told biographer Mark Dawidziak, quote, "Sure, they approached me about it. I thought it was a bad idea. I didn't see how it could be done." End quote. Richard Matheson agreed. Matheson told Dawidziak, quote, "If Dan had done the series, I would have done the series. I couldn't imagine how they could come up with a new monster every week." End quote. The 2 architects of the entire format walked away from the spin-off before anyone had hired a writer. ABC did not take that as a warning. The network took it as an opening and turned to the man who had played the reporter in both television movies. His name was Darren McGavin, and 6 months before the first episode aired, he made a handshake deal that he thought would change his life. That deal is where everything started to fall apart. Darren McGavin was not a newcomer when ABC offered him the series. By 1973, he had already starred in Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer for 2 seasons. He had headlined Riverboat. He had carried The Outsider as a private detective in 1968. McGavin had spent most of his career being typecast as cynical reporters and hard-edged investigators on shows that the networks had not always handled well. Kolchak was the role he had grown into without realizing it. He liked the character. He understood the character. And in March of 1974, he walked into a meeting with Sid Sheinberg, the president of MCA Universal Television, and made a deal. The deal, by McGavin's own account to Mark Dawidziak, was that he would not just star in the series, he would own it. His production company, called Torian Productions, would co-own the show 50-50 with Universal. McGavin himself would executive produce. McGavin told Dawidziak, quote, "I want to own it. I don't want to play around with someone else producing." End quote. Sheinberg shook his hand on it. 6 weeks later, on April 24th of 1974, Variety ran a short item announcing that the series deal had closed with ABC. The item included a single sentence that read, quote, "No producer has been set." End quote. McGavin's deal had evaporated. He never received the executive producer credit. The ownership stake never materialized. He did the producer's work anyway, uncredited and unpaid, because by the time he realized what had happened, he was already in front of the camera and the show had to ship. That is the first force. It was set in motion before a single frame had been shot, and it is the reason for almost everything that happened next. While that was unraveling, a second problem was already in progress. Jeff Rice was the writer who had created Kolchak. The character originated in an unpublished novel of his called The Kolchak Papers, which Richard Matheson had read and adapted for the original television movie. Universal had optioned the property through Matheson's agent without properly securing the weekly series rights from Rice. When the show was greenlit, Rice's lawyer notified Universal that the rights were not settled. Rice sued. Universal settled before the series aired. He got a created by credit on screen. The rest of his creative involvement effectively ended there. A planned 5-novel book deal at Pocket Books collapsed. According to a Las Vegas Review-Journal obituary published in July of 2015, Jeff Rice spent the rest of his life dealing with severe depression and rarely left his home near Desert Inn Road. He died at 71. So the show was being built with no real executive producer, with a creator who had been pushed out by his own lawyers, and with the actor doing producer work in the dark. Universal hired a man named Paul Playden to produce. Playden lasted 2 episodes. After Playden walked, Universal brought in Cy Chermak. Chermak had successfully run Ironside for years and had a track record. Chermak was, in effect, running Kolchak as a side project. The show's composer was Gil Mellé. He had been given 20 minutes to write the main theme and had recycled a cue from an unsold Universal pilot called The Quester Tapes. Mellé walked out after the 4th episode. He later said the show was getting too lighthearted for his taste. Budgets were, in Mark Dawidziak's words, quote, abysmally low, end quote. David Chase, the show's story editor and future creator of The Sopranos, has described production meetings where Chermak would walk in and ask, quote, do we still have the chicken suit from last week? Let's rework that and use it this week, end quote. The show was set in Chicago and filmed almost entirely in Los Angeles on the Universal back lot. One alleyway played a different alleyway every other week. The same office building was used over and over. Scripts arrived on set unfinished. McGavin rewrote his own dialogue between takes while doing the work of a producer he was never paid to be. And in the middle of all of that, the man Universal had brought in to fix the show and the man starring in it stopped speaking to each other. That brings us to the second force, and it is the engine that drove everything else. Cy Chermak and Darren McGavin went to war. Chermak's version, given to Mark Dawidziak years later, is unusually frank. Chermak said, quote, one of the reasons tensions ran so high on the show was because the relationship between me and Darren deteriorated rapidly, and everybody knew it. When we were in my office, I was the boss. When they were on the set, and I wasn't there, Darren had them doing what he wanted. He never accepted that I was running the show, end quote. What is striking is what Chermak said next. Chermak told Dawidziak, quote, I think I let the show down by not being able to get along with Darren. Universal needed evolution. I gave them revolution, end quote. Chermak took the blame himself, decades later, for a war he could have de-escalated and did not. McGavin, for his part, had a coherent reason to refuse to accept Chermak's authority. He had been promised the producer's job, he was doing the producer's work, and he was watching a man with no equity in the show treated as a side project while running it his own way. By the midpoint of the season, McGavin was exhausted. He was working 6-day shooting weeks, rewriting on the fly between takes, and fighting a producer he did not respect on a show he had been promised would be his. The episode quality lurched from week to week. Horror in the Heights, written by Hammer horror veteran Jimmy Sangster, was a high. The Energy Eater, 2 weeks later, was a low. The audience could feel the inconsistency. That alone might have been survivable. It would not have killed Kolchak by itself. Beneath all of that, the third force had been killing Kolchak from day one. ABC had scheduled the series for 10 p.m. on Fridays. That time slot was, in McGavin's own words to Mark Dawidziak, quote, the armpit of the world. Everybody dies in that hour, on all networks, end quote. He was not exaggerating. The hour belonged to NBC, which had built the strongest Friday lineup on television. Sanford and Son finished that year as the #2 show in the entire country. Chico and the Man was number 3. The Rockford Files came in at number 12. Directly opposite Kolchak, in the 10 p.m. slot, NBC aired Policewoman, which finished number 15. Kolchak was facing all of that with no marketing support from ABC and no audience habit to draw on. By the end of its only season, it had finished 74th out of 84 network series, averaging a 13.6 rating in a year where the #1 show, All in the Family, was averaging more than double that. ABC tried to fix it midway through the season by retitling the show from The Night Stalker to Kolchak, The Night Stalker, and moving it to Friday at 8 p.m., which is the family hour. The network moved a show about a reporter investigating headless motorcyclists and reanimated corpses into the slot designed for sitcoms. The ratings did improve, just barely, into the low 20s in audience share by January. According to a syndicated television column from that month, the improvement was enough to save the show from immediate mid-season cancellation. It was not enough to save it from the end of the season. That was the third leg of the stool. By the time the network and the studio realized how badly they had set up the show to fail, the star had already made his decision. In the final weeks of production, with 2 episodes still left to shoot, Darren McGavin picked up the phone twice. He called Frank Price, the head of Universal Television. Then he called Marty Starger, the president of ABC Entertainment, the executive who had ordered the series in the first place. McGavin told Mark Dawidziak the conversation in detail. McGavin said, quote, "Do you want to know who canceled this series? I canceled it. I was tired. So I called Frank Price and said, I want out. So I called Marty Starger and said, I want out. Look, will you two get together and cancel this thing? The next day, I got the phone call telling me I was free." End quote. That is the synthesis. The broken Scheinberg deal hollowed McGavin out. Chermak's war ground him down. The Friday slot guaranteed that no rescue was coming. He pulled the plug himself, but he was pulling the plug on a show that the network had already decided not to fight for. That is what killed it. The rubble it left behind contains something strange. The Chermak era, despite the chaos, produced some of the best episodes the show ever made. Horror in the Heights is widely considered the high point of the series. The Spanish Moss Murders aired the same month. Chopper, an episode about a headless motorcyclist seeking revenge from beyond the grave, was credited as a story by Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale. It was their first professional credit, a full decade before they wrote Back to the Future. Stephen King later wrote about that episode in his book Danse Macabre, calling it, quote, "one of the most tasteless programs ever done for network TV," end quote. He meant that as a compliment. In 2005, ABC tried to bring Kolchak back. The new version was developed by Frank Spotnitz, a longtime producer from The X-Files, the very show Kolchak had inspired. Stuart Townsend and Gabrielle Union starred. The pilot included a digitally inserted shot of Darren McGavin's original Kolchak as a tribute. After only 6 of its 10 episodes had aired, the new version was cancelled. The people best equipped to fix Kolchak tried, with a real budget and a real platform, and failed faster than the original. Which makes the trail of careers that came out of those 20 episodes feel almost mathematically impossible. David Chase, the show's story editor, wrote and rewrote half the season. The mob characters he wrote into the episode called The Zombie were the first cousins of the characters he would build a quarter-century later in The Sopranos. Chase has said in interviews, quote, "There was nothing else like it on the air. We knew we were making up this bizarre joke. I hope you can tell there were some people having fun," end quote. Chris Carter, who created The X-Files, has been explicit about the death. Carter pitched the show to Fox by telling executive Peter Roth, quote, "I wanted to do something as scary as a show that was on when I was a kid called Kolchak the Night Stalker. I loved that show," end quote. In later interviews, Carter quantified the inspiration. He said that about 30% of The X-Files came directly from Kolchak. A quarter-century after the cancellation, Chris Carter cast Darren McGavin himself on The X-Files. McGavin refused to play Kolchak again. He agreed to play a new character named Arthur Dales, described on the show as the father of The X-Files. It was one of his final screen roles. He suffered a stroke during the filming of his third appearance and was replaced. In 2025, a 50th anniversary graphic novel anthology celebrating Kolchak, the Night Stalker, won the Bram Stoker Award. The show kept generating new work 50 years after its cancellation. For a series that supposedly nobody watched, it has not stopped working. If you like shows that died before they should have, but never really stopped, subscribe. I'm Bast with Just Iconic Rewinds. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.